The coffee hit the marble floor before the apology ever had a chance to exist. "Watch where you're standing," Richard Calloway snapped, shoving past the man in the gray uniform like he was furniture that had wandered out of place. The doorman staggered back, caught himself on the brass handle, and said nothing. Not a word. Just steadied his footing, straightened his jacket, and reached for the door handle again, because that was his job. Opening doors. Every morning. For men who never looked at his face. Richard didn't slow down. He didn't turn around. He adjusted his cufflinks, smoothed the front of his $3,000 suit, and muttered just loud enough to be heard by the two junior bankers trailing behind him. Guys like that shouldn't even be allowed near a building like this. Probably can't even read the directory. One of the junior bankers laughed nervously. The other looked down at his shoes. The doorman, Marcus Webb, stood there a second longer than necessary, eyes calm, almost amused, watching the back of Richard Calloway's head disappear into the elevator banks of Sterling National Bank's executive tower. What Richard didn't know, what nobody inside that gleaming 52-story building knew except for 3 people on the entire planet, was that the $11 billion acquisition Richard had flown in to close, the deal that was supposed to make his career, the deal his entire firm was betting its future on, could not move forward without one signature. And that signature belonged to the man whose coffee he had just spilled. This is the story of how arrogance walks past power every single day without recognizing it, and what happens when the truth finally opens its own door. Marcus Webb arrived at Sterling National Bank's Manhattan headquarters at 5:40 every morning, a full hour before the first analyst stumbled in with a triple-shot latte and dead eyes. He liked the quiet. He liked watching the city wake up through the glass doors he was paid to open, delivery trucks idling, pigeons scattering, the first gray light catching the top of the building like it was reaching for something it would never quite touch. He was 61 years old. His hair had gone fully silver at the temples, and his hands, though steady, carried the kind of deep creases that come from decades of work most people never noticed. He wore his uniform pressed and clean every single day, not because anyone required perfection from a doorman, but because Marcus Webb had never once in his life done a job halfway. To the executives who passed him each morning, he was wallpaper. A nod here. A grunt there. Occasionally a "thanks, buddy" from someone too busy checking their phone to learn his name after 11 years of employment. But Marcus had built a life most of them couldn't have imagined if they tried. Decades earlier, long before Sterling National Bank had even broken ground on this building, Marcus had been a different man entirely, a quiet engineer turned investor who built one of the most disciplined, private portfolios in the country. He never sought magazine covers. Never wanted his name on buildings. He had grown up watching his father, a hotel porter in Baltimore, get treated like he was invisible by men who didn't deserve to shine his shoes, and Marcus had promised himself something simple: if he ever had power, he would never let it change who he was, and he would never stop seeing the people that other people refused to see. So when his investments grew beyond anything he'd imagined, when the holding company he'd quietly built behind a dozen layers of trusts and shell entities became one of the largest private stakeholders in finance on the eastern seaboard, he made a decision that confused even his own lawyers. He kept working. Not because he needed the money. Because he needed to remember what the world looked like from the ground. "You could retire to an island," Marcus, his attorney, Diane Foster, told him once, exasperated, across a mahogany table in a downtown office. "You could disappear and never be bothered again." Marcus had smiled at her, the same calm smile he gave everyone. "Diane, I've spent my whole life being bothered. I'd miss it." So 3 mornings a week, Marcus Webb put on a gray doorman's uniform and stood outside the very bank he secretly held controlling influence over through Castle Hollow Holdings, an entity so quiet, so carefully shielded, that even Sterling's own board of directors didn't know his name. Only 2 people alive knew the truth: Diane Foster, his attorney, and James Okafor, the bank's quiet, careful chief financial officer, who had personally overseen the encrypted paperwork 3 years earlier when Castle Hollow acquired its silent 41% stake. Marcus liked it that way. He liked watching the world operate honestly around him, unfiltered by the performance people put on for power. But what he witnessed that particular Tuesday morning would test even his famous patience. Richard Calloway had flown in from Chicago the night before on a private jet that wasn't technically his. It belonged to Whitlock Meridian Capital, the firm where he'd clawed his way to senior partner through sheer relentless ambition and a willingness to step over anyone slower than him. At 43, Richard had the kind of polished arrogance that came from never once being told no in a room that mattered. He'd graduated top of his class at Wharton, closed deals that made headlines, and built a reputation as a man who got results, through intimidation when charm failed, and through charm when intimidation wasn't necessary. This deal, the Sterling-Whitlock merger, an $11 billion acquisition that would fold 3 regional banking networks into Whitlock's expanding empire, was supposed to be the crown jewel of his career. Partners didn't usually fly out personally to close mergers this size. But Richard had insisted. He wanted his name attached to this one. He wanted the corner office that came with it. What Richard didn't know, because his research team had somehow never surfaced it, buried as it was beneath layers of legal shielding, was that Castle Hollow Holdings held veto power over any acquisition exceeding 30% of Sterling's total equity value. This deal exceeded that threshold by nearly double. Which meant the entire merger, the entire reason Richard Calloway had flown to New York with his team, the entire foundation of his next promotion, depended entirely on a signature from an entity whose actual controlling principle nobody at Whitlock had ever met. Richard didn't know any of this as he stormed through the lobby that morning, irritated that his coffee order had been wrong, irritated that traffic from the airport had eaten into his prep time, irritated in the particular way that men like Richard get irritated when the world doesn't move at the exact speed they expect. So when Marcus Webb, simply doing his job, opened the door a half-second slower than Richard wanted because he was assisting an elderly woman exiting at the same time, Richard didn't see a 61-year-old man balancing 2 responsibilities with quiet grace. He saw an obstacle. "Move," he snapped, shouldering past, knocking the coffee from Marcus's hand, coffee Marcus had been holding for the same elderly woman, Mrs. Calderon, a longtime Sterling shareholder who came in every Tuesday to deposit her late husband's pension check. The cup hit the marble. Brown liquid spread across the polished floor in a slow, spidering stain. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Calderon," Marcus said immediately, crouching down, pulling a cloth from his pocket, his voice calm and warm despite what had just happened. "Let me get you a fresh one." "That man should learn some manners," Mrs. Calderon huffed, glaring at Richard's retreating back. Richard didn't even turn around. "Guys like that shouldn't even be allowed near a building like this," he said to his junior bankers, loud enough for it to land exactly where he wanted it to land. "Probably can't even read the directory." The words hung in the lobby air like smoke. Marcus straightened up slowly. He looked at the spreading coffee stain. He looked at the elevator doors closing behind Richard Calloway. And something flickered behind his calm eyes, not anger, not really. Something closer to recognition. The kind of recognition a man has when he meets, once again, a particular type of person he has encountered his entire life. He simply nodded once to himself, picked up the now empty cup, and reached for the door handle for the next person walking in. But what happened next would shock the entire executive floor of Sterling National Bank. By 9 a.m., the 32nd floor conference room was filling with Sterling's senior leadership team, nervous energy crackling beneath the surface of expensive suits and rehearsed smiles. CEO Harrison Vance stood at the head of the table, reviewing notes with the kind of forced calm men adopt when their company's future depends on the next 4 hours. "Whitlock's team is downstairs," said Patricia Lynn, Sterling's chief legal officer, scanning her tablet. "Calloway wants to move fast. He's already pushing for signatures by end of day." "He always pushes," muttered James Okafor, Sterling's CFO, from the far end of the table. James was a careful man, precise in a way that made him seem cold to people who didn't know him, but warm to the very few who did. He'd been with Sterling for 19 years. He'd also been the one person inside this room who knew exactly why this deal could not move as fast as Richard Calloway wanted it to. "James," Harrison said, "walk us through the equity structure one more time." I want zero surprises today. James hesitated for just a moment, a pause so brief that nobody else in the room noticed it. Sterling's equity is distributed across several major holders, James said carefully. Whitlock's proposal assumes a straightforward majority vote will clear this. But there's a structural detail that requires additional confirmation. What kind of detail? Patricia asked, frowning. There's a minority stakeholder with veto rights on acquisitions of this size, James said. Castle Hollow Holdings. Silence settled over the room. Castle Hollow, Harrison repeated slowly. I've seen that name on filings. I've never met anyone connected to it. Nobody has, James admitted. Their structure is deliberately private. But legally, their sign-off is required. So get them on the phone, Harrison said, frustration creeping into his voice. Today. Before Calloway finds out there's a wrinkle he doesn't know about. James nodded, already reaching for his phone beneath the table. He had one contact saved under Castle Hollow Holdings. A single number. A man who almost never picked up unless it truly mattered. But what none of them knew, what would shock every single person in that conference room within 48 hours, was that the principal behind Castle Hollow Holdings was, at that very moment, 3 floors below them, mopping a coffee stain off the lobby floor in a gray uniform that none of them had ever bothered to look at twice. The day moved fast after that. Richard Calloway commanded the executive boardroom by 11, laying out Whitlock's acquisition terms with the practiced confidence of a man who had given this presentation 100 times. Slides flashed across the screen, projected synergies, cost reductions, branch consolidations, headcount optimizations, that everyone in the room understood meant layoffs. This merger positions Sterling as the dominant regional player on the East Coast, Richard said, pacing the front of the room like he owned it already. Whitlock brings infrastructure. Sterling brings legacy clients. Everyone wins. Harrison Vance nodded along, though his eyes kept flicking toward James Okafor, who sat quietly typing on his phone beneath the table. After the meeting broke, James pulled Harrison and Patricia aside in the hallway. I reached out to Castle Hollow's representative, James said quietly. They're requesting an in-person meeting before any signatures move forward. Tomorrow morning. In person? Harrison said. With who? Do we even know who runs this thing? I know who their attorney is, James said. A woman named Diane Foster. She handles all communications. The principal himself stays, extremely private. This is exactly the kind of delay Calloway is going to lose his mind over, Patricia warned. Then we manage Calloway, Harrison said firmly. We are not signing anything until Castle Hollow confirms. That's not optional. That's the law. Down in the lobby, Marcus Webb finished his shift at 2 p.m., as he always did 3 days a week, hanging his gray uniform jacket in the small employee locker room behind the security office. He changed into a simple navy sweater and dark slacks, clothing that, on closer inspection, was tailored with the kind of quiet precision only the wealthiest clients ever bothered to request. He walked 2 blocks to a black town car waiting at the corner, the same driver who had picked him up for 11 years, a man named Curtis who had become something close to a friend. Rough morning, Mr. Webb? Curtis asked, glancing in the mirror as Marcus settled into the back seat. Same as always, Marcus said, allowing himself a small, tired smile. Some people see a door and think it opens itself. Curtis chuckled. They'll learn. They usually do, Marcus said quietly, looking out the window as the bank tower shrank behind them. Eventually. What Curtis didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Marcus had already received a call from Diane Foster 15 minutes earlier, informing him about the Whitlock acquisition, about the veto clause, about a name that had caught both their attention the moment it crossed Diane's desk that morning. Richard Calloway. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment in the back of the car, remembering the coffee spilling across the marble floor, remembering the words tossed over a shoulder like garbage. Diane, he said quietly into his phone, schedule that meeting for tomorrow morning. 10 o'clock. And don't tell them who's coming. You're sure? Diane asked. I want to see his face, Marcus said simply, when he finds out. But what Marcus didn't yet know was that the truth would take far longer to fully surface than even he expected, because Richard Calloway was about to make one more mistake that would change everything. That evening, Richard held a private dinner at a steakhouse near Central Park with 2 Whitlock board members who had flown in specifically to monitor the deal's progress. Over aged ribeye and a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's weekly paycheck, Richard laughed off the morning's delay. Some paperwork wrinkle, he said dismissively. Sterling's legal team is being overly cautious. We'll have signatures by Thursday. You're confident? Asked one board member, a stern older woman named Eleanor Cross. I didn't get to where I am by being uncertain, Richard said, swirling his wine. This deal closes. I promise you that. What he didn't mention, what he didn't even consider worth mentioning, was the doorman incident that morning. It hadn't registered as anything. Just another faceless person who didn't matter, the way hundreds of faceless people hadn't mattered across Richard's entire career. But Eleanor Cross, sharper than Richard gave her credit for, had noticed something during their drive into the building that morning. She'd seen the coffee spill. She'd seen the dismissive words. And something about it had bothered her in a way she couldn't quite name. Richard, she said carefully, I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Of course. This morning, in the lobby. The man at the door. Richard waved a hand. What about him? You were rude to him, Eleanor said plainly. Unnecessarily so. Richard laughed, genuinely surprised by the question. Eleanor, he's a doorman. I barely even. That's exactly my point, Eleanor said, her voice cooling. You barely even noticed him as a person. That tells me something about how you operate when you think no one important is watching. Richard's smile faded slightly. It was nothing. A bad morning. It won't happen again. See that it doesn't, Eleanor said, returning to her wine. Sterling has a reputation for valuing every employee, from the boardroom to the lobby floor. If our merger creates a culture clash before it even closes, that reflects on Whitlock too. Richard nodded along, but inwardly, he dismissed the concern entirely. A doorman was a doorman. Eleanor was old-fashioned, sentimental about things that didn't matter in the world of billion-dollar mergers. He had no idea how wrong he was about to be proven. The next morning, when Richard arrived at Sterling's headquarters for the scheduled meeting with Castle Hollow's representatives, he walked through those same glass doors with the same dismissive confidence, never once recognizing that the calm-eyed man holding the door for him the day before was about to walk into the boardroom as something else entirely. The 32nd floor conference room had never felt so tense. Harrison Vance sat at the head of the table, Patricia Lynn to his right, James Okafor beside her, fingers laced tightly together. Richard Calloway sat across from them, flanked by Eleanor Cross and his junior bankers, his expression a mixture of impatience and forced professionalism. I appreciate Castle Hollow finally agreeing to engage directly, Richard said, checking his watch. Though I have to say, the secrecy around this entity has been somewhat unusual for a deal of this size. Privacy isn't the same as obstruction, Mr. Calloway, Patricia said evenly. The door opened. Diane Foster walked in first, sharp in a charcoal suit, carrying a slim leather folder. And behind her, Marcus Webb. Dressed not in gray, but in a perfectly tailored navy suit, his silver hair combed neatly back, his expression calm and unreadable in the way it always was. Richard glanced at him for half a second and looked away, assuming he was some kind of assistant or security escort. He didn't recognize him. Why would he? In Richard's mind, men like that simply didn't exist outside of doorways and parking garages. Good morning, Diane said, taking a seat at the table. I'd like to introduce Mr. Marcus Webb, principal and controlling owner of Castle Hollow Holdings. The room went silent. Richard blinked. I'm sorry, what? Mr. Webb holds the controlling interest that triggers veto authority over this transaction, Diane continued smoothly. He's here to discuss the terms personally. Richard stared at Marcus, his mind struggling to process what he was looking at. The calm, silver-haired man across the table looked deeply, unmistakably familiar, and then it hit him with the force of a physical blow. The doorman. The man whose coffee he'd spilled. The man he'd shoved past. The man he'd called guys like that in front of his entire team less than 24 hours earlier. This is, Richard started, then stopped, his face draining of color. This has to be some kind of mistake. No mistake, Marcus said quietly, his voice calm, the same voice he used every single morning greeting strangers at a door. Good to see you again, Mr. Calloway. The room remained frozen, every executive present trying to reconcile what they were witnessing. But this was only the beginning of what Richard Calloway was about to lose that day. Richard's voice cracked slightly, then steadied as he tried to reclaim his composure. You're telling me the man holding the door yesterday is the same person controlling 41% of Sterling's voting equity? 41.3%, to be precise, James Okafor confirmed quietly from across the table. Richard turned to Harrison Vance, desperate for some kind of explanation that made this make sense. Did you know about this? I knew Castle Hollow's principal preferred anonymity, Harrison said carefully. I didn't know the specifics of how he spent his mornings. Marcus folded his hands calmly on the table. I built Castle Hollow's holdings over 30 years, Mr. Calloway. Quietly. Carefully. I never wanted attention, and I never needed it. I work at this building 3 mornings a week because it keeps me grounded in something most people in rooms like this forget. And what's that? Eleanor Cross asked, leaning forward, genuinely curious despite the tension crackling around her. That everyone deserves basic respect, Marcus said simply, regardless of what job they're doing when you meet them. Richard's jaw tightened. Mr. Webb, I sincerely apologize for yesterday. It was unprofessional. It won't happen again. I appreciate that, Marcus said evenly. But I'm not here to discuss an apology. I'm here to discuss whether this merger proceeds at all. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. What does that mean? Richard asked, his voice tightening. It means, Diane Foster interjected, sliding the leather folder across the table, that Castle Hollow has serious concerns about Whitlock's proposed headcount reductions, branch closures in lower-income communities, and the overall cultural direction this merger would impose on Sterling's existing workforce. This is standard consolidation, Richard said, regaining some footing. Every merger involves efficiency adjustments. Efficiency, Marcus repeated quietly. That's an interesting word for closing branches in neighborhoods that need them most, while protecting executive bonuses untouched. Richard had no immediate answer. I've read your full proposal, Mr. Calloway, Marcus continued. Every page. I know exactly what this merger does to the people at the bottom while protecting the people at the top. I've spent my life on both sides of that line. I know which side gets remembered, and which side gets erased. The room sat in stunned silence. But what nobody yet realized, what would only become clear over the next several hours, was that Marcus wasn't simply going to block the deal outright. He had something else in mind entirely. Something that would humble Richard Calloway far more thoroughly than a simple refusal ever could. I'm not here to kill this merger, Marcus said, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. I'm here to fix it. Richard frowned. Fix it how? Castle Hollow will approve the transaction, Marcus said, under 3 conditions. He opened a folder of his own, sliding 3 single pages across the polished table. First, no branch closures in any community where Sterling is the sole banking option within 5 miles. Second, any headcount reductions must include a minimum 18-month transition package, retraining support, and placement assistance, not just severance and a handshake. Richard's junior bankers exchanged uneasy glances. And the third condition? Eleanor Cross asked, genuinely intrigued now. Marcus looked directly at Richard. Mr. Calloway personally oversees the implementation of Conditions 1 and 2. Not his team. Him. For the full 18 months. Richard's eyes widened. That's not how senior partners typically. I'm aware of how senior partners typically operate, Marcus said calmly. I watched it yesterday morning in a hotel lobby. The words landed like a quiet thunderclap. Richard's face flushed red, humiliation and anger warring visibly across his expression. He looked around the table for support and found none. Eleanor Cross was watching him with an expression that had shifted from curiosity to something closer to disappointment. Harrison Vance remained neutral, but James Okafor's eyes carried the faintest trace of something like satisfaction. This is unprecedented, Richard said finally, grasping for footing. You're asking me to personally babysit. I'm asking you to take responsibility, Marcus interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an unmistakable weight now. For the people whose lives get rearranged so men in nice suits can announce synergies on earnings calls. That's not babysitting, Mr. Calloway. That's leadership. Real leadership. The kind that doesn't disappear once the cameras stop rolling. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Richard Calloway had absolutely no response prepared. But the day's reckoning was far from finished. Word of what happened in that conference room spread through Sterling National Bank with the speed of wildfire by lunchtime. Whispers moved from floor to floor, the doorman, the billionaire, the deal hanging in the balance, the proud investor humbled in front of his own board members. By 2 p.m., Richard found himself standing once again in the lobby, the same marble floor, the same glass doors, waiting for his car back to the airport while his Chicago partners scrambled to process the new terms over frantic phone calls. Marcus was there too, having changed back into his gray uniform for his afternoon shift, opening the door for a young mother struggling with a stroller, offering her a warm smile she returned gratefully. Richard watched him for a long moment. Why do you still do this? Richard finally asked, walking over despite every instinct telling him to simply leave. You don't need this job. You could be anywhere. Why stand here every morning getting ignored by people like me? Marcus considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. My father spent 40 years as a hotel porter, he said. Good man. Hardest worker I ever knew. Men exactly like you walked past him every single day of his life without learning his name. He paused, looking out at the city through the glass. I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever had the power to change how the world treats people like him, I'd use it. But I also promised myself I'd never forget what it felt like to be him. Richard was quiet for a long moment. I judged you the second I saw that uniform, he admitted, his voice quieter now, stripped of its usual armor. I didn't even really see you. Not as a person. No, Marcus agreed. You didn't. I'm sorry, Richard said, and this time, the words carried weight they hadn't carried in the boardroom. Genuinely. Not because of who you turned out to be. Because of how I treated you before I knew. Marcus studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the difference between performance and truth. That, Marcus said finally, is the only kind of apology worth accepting. But the story wasn't quite finished yet. There was one final piece of truth still waiting to surface, one that would determine whether Richard Calloway's change of heart was real, or just another performance for an audience he thought still mattered. 18 months later, Eleanor Cross sat in Sterling National Bank's lobby, waiting for a meeting, watching the morning rush of executives moving through the glass doors. She noticed something different this time. No branch closures had happened in the communities Marcus had specified. Headcount reductions, where necessary, had come with the full transition packages promised, not just on paper, but in practice, tracked meticulously through quarterly reports Richard Calloway had personally signed off on every single time, exactly as required. Richard himself walked through the lobby that morning, no longer flying in dismissively for a quick closing, but arriving for one of his now regular oversight visits, checking on transition programs he'd once resented being forced into. He stopped at the door, where a younger doorman now worked the morning shift, Marcus having finally, gently, stepped back from the role 2 months earlier, though he still visited occasionally, just to see how things were running. "Good morning," Richard said to the new doorman, stopping fully, looking him directly in the eye. "How's the transition program going on your end? Anyone giving you trouble adjusting the new badge system?" The young man blinked, surprised by the question, surprised even more by being asked at all. "It's going well, sir. Thank you for asking." Richard nodded and continued inside, no audience watching, no boardroom pressure forcing the gesture. Just a small, quiet act of decency that had become, slowly and deliberately, a habit. Marcus, sitting nearby in the lobby's small seating area, watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. Diane Foster, sitting beside him, noticed his expression. "You actually changed him," she said. "I gave him a mirror," Marcus corrected gently. "What he did with the reflection was up to him. And if he hadn't changed?" Marcus shrugged slightly. "Then the conditions stay enforced regardless. Either way, the people at the bottom were protected. His character was simply a bonus." Diane smiled. "Still strategic to the end." "Always," Marcus said.